A couple of weeks ago, I released an episode with Brian Wong, who's a professor of philosophy at the University of Hong Kong, and we got into talking about the ways in which AI causes harm to lots of people. And more specifically, we talked about these sort of two related concepts that he has, the accountability gap and the accountability deficit. The accountability gap, which I know you recall from the last episode, has to do with the fact that lots of people get hurt by AI, but there's no discrete or particular individuals who are responsible for it. It's not, oh, Reed did that to them. Rather, it's, if you like, the AI industrial complex that led to that kind of harm to people. So there's a gap because it's not clear who we're supposed to hold accountable. The accountability deficit is just what happens when no one, if you like, pays up. The people get harmed, they're owed, it looks like they're owed some kind of reparations, but it's not clear who owes them what. So that's the accountability gap and the accountability deficit. And what that leads Brian to is the following claim that we're all responsible in some way. We're all responsible for the harms that have visited upon these people. And it's a bit of an odd position, though, because he thinks that even though people are responsible, you and I are responsible for that harm, we're not blameworthy in any particular way. So let me say something about that to make sure that you understand why this is so philosophically substantive. Usually we think that if someone is morally responsible for something, then if they don't do that thing for which they're morally responsible, then they deserve moral blame. So for instance, I'm morally responsible for taking care of my children, making sure that they're well fed, they have a house, blah, blah, blah. And if I don't take care of them in those ways, then I'm blameworthy. I should be blamed for not taking good care of them. If I go off and I steal something from someone, not to feed my children or anything like that, but just for fun or because I want the thing, then I've breached a moral obligation to not steal from that person, and now I deserve moral blame. So this is a standard way that philosophers and most people think about responsibility and blame. Each individual has a responsibility to do or to not to do something, and failing to do the thing or doing the thing they weren't supposed to do means that they deserve to be blamed. But what's interesting about Brian's position is that he thinks that there's a kind of way in which we can have a moral responsibility, and failing to live up to that moral responsibility doesn't entail that we're being blameworthy. So we are responsible. We, the collective engaged in the AI industrial complex, are responsible for those harms that are visited upon various people. But it's not the case that we're blameworthy in any way if we fail to discharge whatever our responsibilities are. So this is what this part 2 conversation is about now. What does that really amount to? You can't just say, oh, it would be nice of us if we helped out those people that were harmed. Because it's not enough to say, on Brian's account anyway, it's not enough to say, it would be nice of us to do it. It's not, if you like, over and above the call of duty. It is the call of duty. We are responsible for doing things that would repay those people who have been harmed and or do things that would stop future harms from being visited upon people. There's two things that I want to focus on, or two things I want to highlight that you're going to hear a lot in the conversation. One is a question about what makes it the case that we're responsible for those harms. And there, Brian's position is something like this. When you and I engage in the AI industrial complex, as I've just been calling it, we use AI, we go into ChatGPT or into Claude. We use AI in various ways. We talk about it, blah, blah, blah. We are part of the background conditions that reproduce the harms that are getting done. We're part of the background conditions that reproduce the harms that are being done. And so that's what makes it the case. That's what grounds are what he calls forward-looking responsibilities. Forward-looking responsibilities are these special responsibilities that we don't get blamed if we don't live up to them. The other thing I want to highlight, because it might help in some way as you listen to Brian articulate the position, is this point that he makes that you can be criticized without being blamed. You can be criticized without being blamed. So what does that look like? I'm not sure this is the best example, but this is what I used in my conversation with Brian. You can criticize a kid for being a spoiled brat. Or maybe they're 5 years old, they're a spoiled brat, they're deserving of some kind of criticism, or you can critique them. But you don't blame them. It's not their fault that they're spoiled brats. Their parents are the ones that spoiled them. So you can criticize the kid or critique the kid as being a spoiled brat, perhaps not to his face, but that doesn't mean that you're blaming them. So I think that Brian wants to make use of this distinction where we can be critiqued or criticized for not discharging these special kinds of responsibilities, even though we can't be blamed for it. Okay. There's lots of this conversation, as you'll see. What I want to highlight, though, and what I like so much about these two episodes, which is this is something I said last time as well, is that we're all familiar with the sort of big harms that are visited upon lots of people by virtue of people using AI, the environmental harms, the ways in which labor is exploited to build AI in the first place. And we start getting into, okay, so these bad things are happening, so who's responsible? Who's accountable? And what we're forced into, intellectually speaking, is thinking about what do we mean when we say who's responsible? Is it that no one is responsible? Is it that, as Brian maintains, we're all responsible? But what does that really amount to? And so we go from these concrete harms visited upon people to a sort of intellectual, ethical inquiry into the nature of these responsibilities. So I hope what you're seeing here is the purpose and value of philosophical inquiry, because what we're doing in this conversation is really hardcore, deep philosophical inquiry, the kinds of stuff that professors engage in, that professional philosophers engage in. So even if you don't follow every in and out of this argumentation that you're about to listen to, what I hope you come to appreciate is the way in which this kind of inquiry, this discussion is called for, given a concern for these very concrete harms. Okay, so big conversation, lots going on. If you like this kind of stuff, then please consider supporting me at readblackman.substack.com. I think I charge now $5 a month or $60 a year. I don't even charge. I just say if you want to donate and you want to support the podcast, I'd appreciate it. To those of you who did subscribe since the last episode, thank you so much. I appreciate it. If you want to email me with suggestions about who to have on the podcast, you've got questions, trench criticism, em@readblackman.com. All right, let's go talk to Brian. All right, so Brian, last time we talked, towards the end of our conversation, we started talking about these two concepts that you highlighted. One is the accountability gap. The other is the accountability deficit. So the accountability gap is bad things happen to some people. Let's say it's the result of AI or whatever it is. It doesn't really matter. But bad things happen, and there's no individual or set of individuals, discrete individuals who we can say they're the ones who we should hold accountable, because there's too much of a crazy causal mix, I suppose, to say like, that's the person. And so that's the accountability gap. And then the deficit is bad things have happened to these people. They're owed some kind of compensation or reparations or something along those lines. The justice demands that they get some kind of compensation, and yet they've received no such compensation, and so that's the deficit. So we then talked about, okay, so there's two claims here. You could think if we can't identify discrete individuals or set of individuals that we can hold accountable, then I guess no one's responsible, no one's accountable, and we're just in a sort of, you didn't put it this way, but I'll put it this way, it's just a shitty situation in which bad things happen and no one is responsible. That's one option. But you reject that option, you go in for a different claim, which is if we can't identify discrete individuals for whom we should hold accountable for the bad things that happened, then everyone is responsible. And that's a really interesting claim. And so I take it that the purpose of this conversation is to explore the underpinnings, the justification for what looks like a rather odd claim. Yeah. At least I think on the face of it, people say, no, what did I have to do with it? So I think that's where we are now. So let's get into it. Why should we think that everyone is responsible when bad things happen for which there's no discrete individuals to hold accountable?
Thank you very much.
And I'll say one last thing. Let's think, that's super abstract. We're philosophers, so we speak in the abstract. But to take something more abstract, if there's some AI system out there that's passed through the hands of dozens, maybe hundreds of data scientists and executives who have greenlit things at each stages, and different people have used different tools, and there's data collectors, and there's the people who have done the fine tuning, and there's so many, and then you wind up with, let's say, widespread discrimination against, let's say, women or people of color or something like that, or there's massive privacy violations, and we want to hold discrete individuals accountable. How do we do that? And your point is something like everyone is. So let's take it from there.
Thanks, Reed. I want to just start off by making a pretty obvious observation that perhaps runs slightly contrary to what I'm suggesting and advancing at large, which I think you've quite accurately captured. I don't think anyone at all is to be held responsible for lightnings alternatively for rainstorms or tropical cyclones per se.
Yeah.
Although, to be fair,
sure.
with climate change and also runaway greenhouse gas and greenhouse effects, you might argue that tropical cyclones have to do with human action. But by and large, natural disasters are not what we'd call something that grounds retrospective liability, whether it be in a sort of blame-centered sense for which someone's blameworthy, or in a non-blame attached sense, right? We still wouldn't say, hey, you're Reed responsible for the rainstorm. So I want to just start off by conceding and noting that I'm not suggesting that if something's purely abstract, purely natural, and ultimately uncaused by human action, that we're still going to say everyone's liable. Or at the very least, to the extent there's liability, it's no more relevant and no more than just merely a general duty to mitigate the harms of tropical cyclones by building anti-flooding barriers and architecture. So that's the first piece of my response to your question. But the second piece is to note the following. By saying that Agent X has a degree of liability, that all that means is that X should be open to taking up or shouldering a portion of the costs required, and that could be monetary, that could be non-monetary, in redressing something, or alternatively, in undertaking something. Okay, so take a step back and say in undertaking some omega or some delta. Nowhere in this liability statement or the stipulation of liability is there an element of blameworthiness. So I'm not saying that X is blameworthy for omega and that therefore X ought to do something about it. Sure, there might be a subset of liability, say moral liability, that says X is morally responsible for omega, X ought to redress the effects of omega. So if I'm an intentional murderer, I stab someone because I want to kill them, that person dies, I'm clearly morally responsible. So what we're therefore looking at here is the grey area between the two ends of this spectrum. On one end, you've got this sort of clearly defined moral liability. On the other hand, or the other end rather, you've got natural events that are not caused by artificial causes and for which no one at all is to bear any liability. What I'm intrigued by is the middle ground, and the questions of, or the domain of liability without blame. And this is the starting point of my account, where I draw heavily upon the works of one wonderful political theorist with the name Iris Marion Young. And she's truly rather a remarkable thinker in so many different ways. And of course, she was at USHIG before she passed away, very tragically, around 10 to 15 years ago. And Young essentially coined this framework called the social connection model of responsibility towards injustice, and responsibility towards justice, rather, in response to injustice. An essential crux of her thesis is as follows. Firstly, we as human agents are socially connected to one another, provided that we satisfy a number of insert conditions that she never really quite made as clear as she could have, perhaps, but she probably wanted to had she been given more time to do so. And premise two, in virtue of our social connections to one another, and more specifically the injustices that occur on a large scale, on a collective scale, which she takes as essentially a large-scale domination and subjugation by one group of individuals of another group of individuals, whereby these groups may not be behaving with intention in carrying out such domination and subjugation, and yet do so in practice. And finally, from which, of course, one of these groups benefits and the other group suffers, that in these instances of structural injustices, there ought to be forward-looking responsibilities to be undertaken and borne and undertaken and discharged by individuals who are connected to such injustices that do not involve blame unto themselves. So that is essentially her central claim concerning the SCM model, the social connection model of responsibility towards justice. Now, very quickly, applying this to AI, my argument is that...
But before we apply to AI, let me see if I can simplify it a little bit. I'm going to give you a kind of toy case. Good. It's a real story, but tell me if I'm beginning to get at it. Just tell me what's not capturing Young's view. I was not a particular gracious teenager. Okay, so I grew up upper middle class in Connecticut, nice, beautiful suburb, whatever, lovely, bit boring, but okay, that's fine. And my parents, I forgot, we were in the backyard. My grandparents were there too, and my mother wanted me to do something. It may have been yard work, or it was something that I didn't want to do that had to do with something like general upkeep of the house. And I think my attitude was something like, I didn't agree to do any of this shit. I didn't agree to whatever it was, rake the leaves or spread the mulch or whatever it was. And my grandmother said, but you use the advantages that upkeep of this house grants. You live in the house. It's nice. It's clean. You enjoy the backyard. It's not a mess. There's even a pool back there. And so you've taken some part in enjoying the benefits, and you thereby owe your parents to help them with the upkeep of the house, blah, 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 blah. I know that there's some disanalogy between what you're talking about, but maybe you can say something about that situation. Is that the kind of thing that Young is talking about, or is that sort of in the neighborhood, or is it a separate thing that she's talking about?
So I think the beauty of that example...
By the way, I was convinced. My grandmother convinced me, and I helped out. I thought, okay, shit, that was a good argument. All right,
well,
I'll
Nan's
help
usually
out.
very convincing. Nan's usually extremely persuasive.
A nun,
yeah, the
okay.
Nan.
My grandmother was nun.
Not Nan. That's a...
Oh, Nan. Like grandmother.
Yes,
exactly. She was persuasive, yeah.
So I think the beauty of that example is it speaks to the complexity and also the ambiguity in Young's original statement of the social connection model, which is to say that, based on the example you supplied there, Reed, there are three ways of interpreting what's going on. And the first and the most obvious candidate for explanation is the beneficiary pays principle. And there, as advanced by, say, Daniel, the argument goes that if one benefits from, say, an injustice, but in your case, of course, there was no injustice, but say, if I were to benefit from an injustice, then I ought to take up the responsibility of redressing the effects of the injustice, or else I'd quote unquote, Murphy, which is again someone that Butt quotes in his works, right? Long story short, I come across as a moral slime. So it's a bit like a slimy piece of work. So that's one way of cashing out the explanation there. Another interpretation is complicity. So you talked about you're being complicit to some extent in using and maybe contributing towards the weeds, the mess, the, I don't know what the technical terms are, I suppose, the uneven and also slovenly appearance, unkempt appearance of the yard, okay? So therefore you're complicit in the wear and tear, okay? So that's another way of reading the situation. The third interpretation, though, is the social connection model. And of course, it's worth prefacing that Young herself doesn't quite explain how the SCM is different from, or it might actually be reducible into complicity or beneficiary pays, right? But what she does say is that whatever it is, whatever the ground exactly is, the type of responsibility is different. So if you're morally complicit, you might have moral responsibilities. If you're benefiting from injustice, you might also cultivate to some extent a sort of moral, or at least quasi-moral liability vis-a-vis what you're benefiting from. But in the event that you are connected to an injustice and merely connected, the responsibility that generates need not be and does not have to be blame-centered. So then the question becomes, what does connection mean? Reed, you're going to ask me that question. I'm going to ask myself that question. And here's where I find Maeve McCohen's work quite illuminating on this front, where she says, actually, there's several ways of interpreting what connection means. One way is to say, okay, existence. If you exist in the same society or within the same collective, so to speak, more precisely, as the unjust or the perpetrators of the injustice and also the victims of the injustice, then that existence alone counts as a connection. But she rejects that. She thinks that's way too broad, because you basically include into the mix here all sorts of non-moral agents who exist in a society and community and yet are not actually meaningfully socially connected, and we can't attribute connection to, so to speak. So another interpretation, the second interpretation, is dependence. In other words, if X is dependent upon a series of structural processes that generate injustices, then X should be deemed as connected to these injustices. But here is where, again, we run into fairly counterintuitive implications, which is to say that we only accrue social connection engendered responsibilities if we're victims to some extent of the same structures that produce these injustices, right? So if I'm a sweatshop worker, I therefore have to take up a responsibility to deal with global sweatshop labor because I am a dependent upon these unjust structures. That again seems to be rather odd and counterintuitive, and that is where McCohen essentially introduces a new interpretation. She argues that social connection is best conceptualized as the reproduction of the background conditions for unjust processes. Let's unpack that in more layperson terms. It is to say that when I intentionally partake in certain activities, and by intentionally I don't mean intending to cause harm or do harm or contribute towards the negative, the detrimental states, but instead I behave with intention and a degree of autonomy when I carry out certain actions, and these actions feed into the background conditions that eventually down the line cause or precipitate, or at least in some sense create the fermenting grounds for the injustices to occur, even if there's no strict sort of counterfactual based causality to be established there. And that is what she terms to be essentially a reproduction of the background conditions for injustice. And I think that's a fairly persuasive way of reading the social connection model that isn't reducible into either complicity-centered accounts or beneficiary pays accounts, right? They might be related to the SCM, but they're not the SCM. And I think it's imperative we disentangle them, so to speak.
Okay. Let's change my family example for a second to some things that are not for real. So suppose that my parents actually slyly murdered the previous occupants of the
Right.
house,
Good.
except for the children. There was a family there.
Okay.
They killed those parents. Those 2 kids became orphans. And then we moved in. I didn't know
Yeah.
this. I was a wee lad.
Okay.
So an injustice has been done, clearly.
Yeah.
Compensation, reparations, etc. are owed to
Good.
those 2 orphans. Things continue. And I guess, let's say I find out about
Good.
this. I think the condition that I have to, I grow up, I'm 18, whatever. I find out about this. And I can do one of 2 things. I can say, Mom, Dad, you're morally gross. This is reprehensible. I'll have no part of this. I am moving out tomorrow, or I'm moving out this minute. I'm going to be contacting the orphanage. I'm going to try to find these people. I'm going to try to make compensation. I'm calling the police, blah, 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 blah. In that case, I don't have any... I'm not responsible for that injustice.
Sure.
I'm not playing a role in the upkeep of the injustice, etc. And so I don't have any sort of special moral obligations to those orphans or something like that. I might go above and beyond the Call of Duty or something along those lines, but that's a separate thing. On the other hand, if I said, Mom and Dad, that's some crazy shit, but yeah, your secret's safe with me.
Yeah.
I love this house. I'm not going anywhere. I'll keep it a secret. If anyone knocks on the door asking about a checkered past, I'll make sure to lie and make sure that they're deceived and we don't get found out. And so now that's me playing an active role in perpetuating the injustice, something along those lines.
Yeah.
And in that case, I've now taken on some responsibility for... I'm now properly in the realm of moral wrongness. And I'm accountable for the accountability deficit that those orphans suffer.
Good, Reed. But I want to push back against that differentiation or that cut that you're proposing there. And that's to say, even if you chose to walk away, so, if you chose to walk away, let's call it option 1. Now, option 1A is you choose to walk away and you report your parents to the police, right? And that's what you were hinting at. And in that case, of course, you'd be, I'd say, not just doing what you're supposed to do, required to do in a sort of obligatory sense, but also going above and beyond. So that's supererogatory, right? But then there's also option 1B, where you walk away, you say, I want none of this. I don't want to live in this house. It gives me terrible memories, but I wouldn't tell anyone about it. But in that case, you're still actively covering up the injustice. The only difference here is that you're not emotionally attached to or intimately associated with your parents, qua a member of the same family, as you might be in the second scenario, where, of course, there's also the subjective sort of identification, right, where you identify with the collective that can be deemed as continuous over time, right? So it's a bit like my saying, I know that my nation committed and perpetrated genocide, hypothetically, against some other nations in the past, but I'm proud of being a part of this nation. Therefore, in virtue of my subjective identification, I could be held responsible. And that is what grounds standard nationalist accounts of responsibility. If you look at Arash Abizade's writings on shame and pride, and also David Miller's writings as well, I think that's where this kicks in. But if I say, I don't like this nation, I want to walk away from this nation, but I'm not going to tell anyone about something that only I know, which is the atrocities and injustices that the nation historically committed, I'm still complicit in the perpetration of injustices towards the descendants of the original victims. And you can cash this out in several ways. Had I actually reported on the injustice, these victims' descendants would have received compensation. So that's one thing. And another angle here is that my continued inability to settle the moral score inadvertently perpetrates a system or sort of a relational inequality between myself and these victims' descendants. And that, again, is a secondary harm or sort of second-order harm, so to speak, building on existing injustices. I think all of this is interesting and fascinating. And if we were to bring this back to AI, because I'm sure some of those listening might be thinking, what has this got to do with AI? I would flag the following. Without naming names, there's been a large number of AI, more precisely data labeling, data sorting and classification companies that have drawn heavily upon exploitational wages and exploited dirt cheap labor from global south countries, in Venezuela, in Kenya, and even parts of India and Bangladesh. They've drawn upon such labor to do the quote-unquote dirty work, which really is quite grueling if you think about it. Sorting through videos that might feature really obscene content and viral transgressions, and then trying to figure out which of these is quote-unquote kosher, which of these is less kosher, which of these is totally off limits. This is excruciating, and yet the wages that these workers have received in the past are frankly not commensurable with, of course, the kind of pains they had to endure. Not even if we were to take into account purchasing power parity, and of course, what a living wage constitutes in their respective constituencies. Now, in these cases, I would posit that we are all of us here, using LLMs, using models, whatever we're using, as long as the models draw upon in supervised or unsupervised learning data that's been previously labeled, and of course largely supervised, okay, and somewhat reinforcement in this particular set of cases. To the extent we're benefiting from such models, I would posit that we therefore accrue beneficiary pays centered or grounded liabilities to redress the effects of said injustices, to seek to intervene. And of course, the challenge that we would get is, how is this an injustice? Surely sweatshop labor is not injustice. Poorly paid workers, that's not an injustice. They could be paid more, sure, but had it not been for this job, they would have been jobless with no pay whatsoever. But the trouble with this view is I think it ignores that there are certain rights-based claims that are not susceptible to this counterfactual-based rejoinder. And that's to say that even if you would have been worse off without a certain form of intervention, the fact that this intervention occurs maybe without your consent or in a de-dignifying and disrespectful manner or in a way that frankly is less than what you deserve in an absolute intrinsic sense, that is unto itself an intrinsic injustice. And this is where, you know, David Benatar's differentiation between intrinsic and extrinsic costs and intrinsic and extrinsic injustice of individuals undergoing certain detrimental states comes into play here. I think we can grant that these workers would have been much worse off, in some cases maybe, had they not been given this data labeling job, which is contingent, casualized, poorly unionized, and there's a dearth of protection, sure, but it's still better off working in them. But still, better off in a welfare sense does not translate to, therefore, all things considered justified or indeed morally appropriate and normatively apt. And that is where I would say we can identify cases of injustices. But this is a somewhat separate from my SCM claim. I just thought it's interesting to pick up on what you raised there on the garden and backyard example and expand it and link it back to AI, so to speak. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that is helpful. So to do the translation, make it explicit, the house is an LLM. My parents is a foundational model company, for instance, like an OpenAI or a
like
Google or whatever.
An OpenAI, good. We're not saying... Yeah, very good, excellent. I think that's very important.
Akin to. Then me enjoying the benefits of the house / LLM is I'm the user of an LLM. I use Claude, I use ChatGPT or whatever, or something like that. And the orphans, of course, are those are translated to the members of third world countries that are working... have really shitty, to put it almost euphemistically, working conditions in which the work requires a kind of suffering a mental trauma that is not commensurate with the pay they receive and perhaps not with any level of pay that they would receive.
And of course, the orphans aren't paid to be orphans, so there's a slight disanalogy there, but yes. You're right.
Things break down. Yeah, no, that is helpful. And then you ran through the sort of obvious objection, which is if they didn't have that job, then they would have no job and the family would starve. And the point is something like, even if that's true, that doesn't make it okay. Actually, what was the case? I actually gave this kind of case. We were talking about the example that I gave was something. This was in the context of talking about mitigating the biases of a model, and it was something like, if it's less biased than the alternative, let's say humans, then we're in the ethical clear here, right? And I said, just because it's a moral improvement doesn't mean it's morally permissible. Good. So the example I gave was, suppose I actually gave an orphanage example. I don't know why I'm so fixated on orphans. Maybe it's because of Batman. I don't know.
Not Superman. But, no, Superman.
Right. Okay. That's right. He was an orphan, but never in an orphanage. No, that's the crucial. Actually, neither was Bruce Wayne. He wasn't.
Exactly.
Okay. Besides the point, I didn't realize they were both orphans. That's got to be meaningful in some way. I said, look, suppose you ran an orphanage and you killed it was something like, and at the orphanage, they got beaten every day. And then you adopt the kid from this brutal orphanage, and you beat them every other day. And you say, look, they're better off than they were before. They're in a morally better circumstance than they were before. They're only getting beaten every other day, not every other day. So I'm in the ethical clear, right? And the answer is, no, you're not in the ethical clear. Yes, you've improved their moral situation, but you're still doing something that's morally reprehensible. It's still morally unacceptable. You're still beating them every other day. Absolutely. So the fact that you morally improve their situation doesn't mean that you're in the ethical clear.
And I think that's two observations there. The first is a quick point commenting on this case. And I can actually strengthen your argument even further by noting that even if in a counterfactual, even if these orphans would have still been beaten every day in a counterfactual, right? Still, that counterfactual-based differential does not alter the normative, or more precisely, the moral impermissibility of your beating the children. Although, of course, the pushback to you would then say, no, because you're picking the wrong counterfactuals here, Reed and Brian. The actual counterfactual, the moment these orphans end up in your care, right? The actual counterfactual is a world where you don't beat these orphans at all, and therefore they are worse off than it otherwise would have been had you not chosen to beat them. But then that's where we get into complex debates over what are the relevant counterfactuals in assessing harm and benefit. I could have been Bill Gates in some sense, right? I would be Bill Gates in a possible world. That's 10,000 light years, in brackets, spatial temporally disconnected from this world. But why is that relevant? It could be Hillary Clinton, or Hillary Clinton could have been the president in lieu of Donald Trump, whatever. But that does not mean that these counterfactuals are germane. So I guess that's where we get into what Smolansky terms, very complex counterfactual stipulation or a counterfactual quagmire. Okay, so back to the bigger point I want to make here, though, which is essentially on structural injustice. Are two core features that I personally identified in most examples of structural injustices that Young or McCohen and even Robin Zheng, they write on, so to speak, over the past decade or so that these theorists have worked on or written on. And the first feature is what we call collective harm. Okay, so they are usually harms that arise, but only upon the reaching or the satisfaction of a particular threshold of scale and size. For instance, if I were to insult you, right, with a very flippant insult in a one-on-one context, that doesn't really mean much, right? Sure, it might hurt, but it doesn't have the kind of gravitas or harm that would be inflicted upon you if I were, say, a part of a much bigger collective or a loosely defined group, right? Without coordination, but still a group nonetheless, hurling these slurs at you and slurs of abuse at you. And if you were, of course, a member of an identity group that's targeted by said slur. And I think the same analogy could be applied to, say, animal consumption. If I ate one chicken that's already cooked on my table, I'm not going to be contributing towards any harm, because chances are the chicken butchers or whoever is mass factory farming these chickens would produce exactly the same number of cooked chicken meat, whatever the equivalent of that is, right? Same amount, right? So no change and no delta there. But alternatively, if 1,000 folks in a certain suburb town said, I'm not going to eat any more chicken, or any more chicken meat, okay, then that's going to put an end, really, to, at the very least, the supplier's business to that very town, right? Because the supplier's going to say the overheads are too costly, it's not worth it, I'm not going to deliver fresh chicken to this town. So therefore, the first point to note is that there are collective harms inflicted upon A, the chickens, and B, the identity group that's being targeted here, but only upon a satisfaction of a certain threshold of scale and intensity by extension, or separately as well. The second observation is that the actions of individuals in causing or contributing towards these injustices are contextually excusable. And here I'm going to draw upon an AI case. If I'm an engineer, let's say I'm starting out as an engineer working for one of these large generative AI companies, and my job is very simple. I just need to crack this particular cog in the algorithmic machine to figure out how exactly I can streamline and optimize this part of the parameters, okay, and to reduce the time required and the compute required to get to the exact same outcome. So I'm a part of this huge, sprawling machine, and I, of course, signed up for this company knowing that this is, broadly speaking, what I'm going to be doing. But I don't know who's going to use the AI models. I don't know who my clients are, because I'm not privy to such classified information. I don't have any vested shares, right? So I'm very low down on a pecking order. I'm just an initiate or a fresh grad, okay? So I join a company, I do my bit, and as it turns out, the model that we produce is sold to clients, including, but not limited to, A, corrupt mafia boss operating in Western Italy, and B, a warlord in the Central African Republic using the Gen AI to propagate misinformation about children and women and also religious minorities. So clearly, I'm contextually excusable, right? In a sense, I could not have reasonably been expected to know, although had I read a few more books talking about the evils of companies akin to the other companies you mentioned just then, maybe I'd be a tad more cognizant and alert to such harms. But by and large, I am ignorant. I have broadly excusable ignorance about the effects of my actions, and I'm really contributing a kind of actually unclear amount towards the overall injustice. Now, in that case, there's contextual excusability, and yet because I am partaking in a collective harm of significance, and because I am acting with intention when I'm coding and programming, and I have the intention to complete that task, right? I'm not being held at gunpoint, no one's pointing a gun at me and saying you have to do it. I voluntarily enter into this contract, therefore I accrue, in virtue of my connection to the structural injustice there, forward-looking responsibilities to mitigate and redress and tackle the effects of the injustice in which I am implicated in the background conditions of and reproduce the background conditions of. So that is essentially the sort of motivating example, if you will, to ground what I'm trying to advocate here. And of course, those of you listening back at home and you might raise the following objection, which I'm going to spell out very quickly. Surely,
Wait, hold on.
Before
Objection, let me just make sure I get the view. That engineer, the small cog in the big machine, who doesn't see the causal chain that leads to mafia bosses in Western Italy and warlords in Central Africa. Nonetheless, you think they're still sufficiently connected such that they bear responsibility, these forward-looking responsibilities you call them. Okay, so let me
push back.
You were going to raise an objection. I'm going to raise two other kinds of objections, or I want to hear what you say about these things, and maybe it's going to hit on them. One thing that I want to think about is causal distance or something along those lines, and then the other thing that I want to think of is what it means to be a member of the set of people who cause the harm, and how we attribute responsibilities. Okay, as to the first one, I think that we typically think that the further you removed causally from the outcome that's really bad, the less responsible you are. There's different things to say about maybe you're far back in the causal chain, but your power was outsized. So let's, for the sake of argument, more or less assume that everyone is contributing roughly the same amount. So we're all contributing X units into the causal chain of whatever, of influence. We all have 5 units of influence that we contribute. And let's say the causal chain is, I'm going to say, we'll just pick a random number. It's 1,000 links in that causal chain. And I'm link number 23, something like that. And then this bad thing happens in 1,000. Intuitively, it looks like I'm barely responsible for the outcome of that causal chain. One, and there's lots of reasons. One, my causal contribution is relatively minuscule compared to the other 999 links in the chain. I couldn't have known how all this would play out because there are so many variables. There's just so many variables where things could go different. I'm a finite human. I can't know all the facts. I can't know all the empirical facts on the ground. Things are confusing to me. There's other kinds of mitigating things, like I have to get some kind of job. I have a family. I have obligations to my family to support my children, to send them to school and give them clothing and books and blah, 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 blah. So that's a causal distance thing that I guess I take it. I know that you don't find that persuasive, so I want to know why you don't find that persuasive. And the second thing that I want to register before I lose track of it is, it's one thing to say that the set of people is responsible. It's another thing to say that each individual member of the set is responsible. One, you can say what's true of the whole doesn't mean that it's true of every part of the whole. For those people at home who are not philosophers, to take a sort of mundane example, I could say that the ship has the property of weighing 1 ton. It's not the case that every plank of wood that constitutes that ship weighs 1 million. What did I say? A ton?
Would amount to a ton in total. Although I guess in that case it would actually amount to a ton in total, unless you're saying that people on the ship.
Well, there's a property had by the whole. That's not a property had by.
But
the property of weighing 1 ton.
They could all have the property of being a part of something that, when assembled, would have 1 ton. So there's a correlated.
Yeah, sure, that's fine.
Yeah,
that's fine. But I think that you talked about the meat example. I like the environmental example. I throwing a single piece of plastic into the ocean. It's not going to cause climate change. The problem is that the set of people, driving a car, that's a better example. Driving a car is not going to cause climate change. The problem is that the set of people driving cars causes climate change. Let's just stipulate for the sake of argument. And my causal contribution is so minuscule. It's so 0.00001. Maybe this is going to reduce to the causal complexity, the causal distance thing, but I'm trying to make it slightly different, where it's something like, yes, I'm a member of the set of the whole that caused the harm, but that doesn't mean that each individual member is responsible. Anyway, so I'll stop there. You get
very good read. And I would actually start by saying this is exactly why Young came up with the social connection model, because she wants to, and I think McCohen quite successfully completed her task and vision of disentangling questions of liability, or rather what she terms responsibility without liability, because in her language, liability means moral responsibility, and that's not what she's looking for there, so to speak, as a priority. She wants to disentangle that from causality. She wants to disentangle that from moral responsibility. So on a causal distance claim, this is exactly why it would make no sense to say, oh, I'm implicated in this step, or I cause, step 39, and therefore I am morally responsible for step 100 or step 50. Heck, even step 45 seems pretty far-fetched because, again, my ignorance is excusable. the link between 39 and 45 is too tenuous, and therefore we shouldn't draw this connection and pass that moral responsibility, and yet recognize in the case of this social connection model or modified SCM, essentially, what's at stake here isn't so much causality, but reproduction of background conditions of. And lest I be, or lest they be accused of obfuscating this because it's still a causal question underneath, right? You unveil it and it's still causal.
Right,
I would say it doesn't lean into strict counterfactual-based analyses of causality. Even if it's overdetermined, even if 45 would have happened either way, the fact that I was the 39 and not Bob, not Sam, not Reed, that is alone significant, right? As a ground for, again, this blameless form of responsibility. And to further buttress this, I'd say, there's the penumbra of causal connection. And of course, if we're talking about the connection as tenuous as, say, 1 in 200, I don't think anyone, even the staunchest SCM advocates, would say 1 in 200, one ought to be held in a forward-looking sense responsible for 200, even though they would say probably by that point it'd be a more intimate and proximate 10s and 20s you can identify in a causal chain for which one could still be held responsible, and the practical upshots are the same. But I don't think anyone's going to say 1 to 200 is still a valid distance, because that's way too tenuous and extended a chain. And yet, when it comes to 1 to 30 or 1 to 10, I think these are instances where the moral responsibility account may fail. They would very much, such accounts could fail. And yet the SCM could still pull through in grounding responsibility that is not counterintuitive, because we take away the blame and we take away the allegation that you, in virtue of being the 39 or step 39, must be held morally responsible for whatever happens at step 45. So I guess that's my answer to a causal distance challenge, which I think is interesting, but doesn't necessarily negate the validity and the forcefulness of Young's account, so to speak.
It's not that... So this is what I want to say. Okay, so I presented a view. I didn't give an argument for that causal view. I'm just relying on a classic intuition pump. Oh, they're so far causally removed, blah, so many variables, blah, blah, blah. And what you've presented is a picture that's different from that one, where there is a kind of responsibility, call it forward-looking responsibility. Good. Failure to discharge that responsibility doesn't mean that you're deserving of blame. Mm-hmm. It's a different picture. And I guess I want to say two things. Good. One, and we talked a little bit about this, which is, where are the teeth? Okay, so I have a responsibility, but failure to discharge that responsibility doesn't make me blameworthy, doesn't make me legally accountable. So what's the sort of normative
upshot? I
guess it's not a normative. Yeah. What's the normative upshot? Yeah. So you can say the words, you're responsible in some way, and I say, okay, fine, put that down on my ledger. I don't give a shit. Good. Is this just angels dancing on a pin? And then the second point, and maybe it's related to the first, but I don't mean it to be dependent on it. It's something like, okay, it's a different picture. That's an interesting picture. Why should I prefer that picture over the other picture that I painted? And granted, I didn't give you a knockdown argument for it, but you haven't given me a knockdown argument for the alternative picture about forward-looking responsibilities.
I think I'm going to work backwards here. Granting the effects of the injustices we're talking about here are real, and granting that we accept that these are injustices, there's a serious moral burden or sort of moral remainder, so to speak, in relation to unfulfilled responsibilities towards the past. And there's also, of course, correlatively, both present and also likely to be arising in the future, responsibilities towards injustices of a similar kind. So this is a practical observation that there exists this need, this demand for response, okay? And I'm using very vague words here because I think there's a lot of ways of interpreting and cashing out the demand for response here. Okay, we start with that premise. Then, of course, the question is, what gives, right? Do we prefer a world where we say, hey, I'm not morally, in brackets, causally, plus some other further stipulated conditions, say Strawson or Strawsonian or Frankfurt, whatever you call it, these conditions, whatever you like, okay? I'm not morally responsible. Okay, this problem exists. I'm not morally responsible. Bye-bye. Kumbaya. All is well. I'm gone. I'm out of here. Right, see you later. But then the second story is to say, I'm not morally responsible, but I, in virtue of being connected to the injustice here via or qua reproducing so the background conditions, I'm therefore in a forward-looking sense responsible. And I'm willing to discharge said responsibility through, for instance, raising awareness about the problem, through donating towards causes that tackle these issues, or through pushing for governmental reforms and advancing institutional changes. And I think from the get-go, Young has made it very clear that her theorization has to have practical upshots in praxis. And I'll deal with the angels and the pain, what gives and teeth questions shortly. But before we get on to that, I think the reason why I intuitively prefer this story is it enriches and allows for the fine graining of responsibilities beyond the I'm blameworthy, I'm not blameworthy, ta-da, binary and dichotomy, so to speak.
Yeah. Okay, so I like that response, but let me push back on it. So the starting point, the launching point for that response is something like, there are these injustices that demand a response. Mm-hmm. And here's another way of putting that. I'm not saying this is my way, but this is a way that one might put it. I don't have a strong view on this. One might say, here's another way of looking at it. These really unjust things happen, and it sucks. But that's just the way the world is. Shitty things happen. There's not a kind of moral balance inherent in the universe or even in the social universe. And it might be lovely. It might be nice if we could figure out and do the moral math and it all comes out that all the injustices, there's a corollary set of people who are responsible for it. And that helps me sleep at night because there's a kind of moral order that I could rest my hat on. And then in full-blown Nietzschean style, I want to say something like, that's a lovely, comforting story that you've told yourself, where there's a moral order to the universe, social or otherwise. And so you've invented some kind of forward-looking responsibility to do that moral accounting that makes you sleep better at night. But that's all it is. It's a useful fiction for trying to make the world an overall morally sensible place, when in fact it's a morally nonsensical, absurd, shitty place.
But doesn't that objection prove too much in terms of also eliminating the grounds?
Let's find out.
Doesn't that also eliminate grounds for backwards-oriented responsibilities? Because I can pull the same card on you and say, sure, Reed, you might want to say that if you killed someone, you're morally responsible for killing someone, and therefore that ought to be punished for it. But punishment, retribution, and also holding someone to account over wrongs they committed in the past, this is only a useful fiction. It doesn't exist in a universe, right? This is a moral fabrication, or morality is a fabrication. In fact, I would say the duty to rescue drowning children, again, that's a fiction. This is a story that we tell ourselves, but in fact, we should live in a world where we strive towards excellence. We have to live, and the will to power to define our moral condition and the human condition by extension. So I think that proves too much. That's my worry. So the quasi-nihilistic push perhaps proves too much. And of course, the stronger version of this, by the way, is to say, hold on a second, because at least in the cases where you've committed a wrong, there's a clear attributability, okay? And that's when bringing in attribution literature, Schumacher, Angela Smith, you name it. There's clear attributability. You are the individual who, for whatever reason, right, I can point to this and say, this is a part of your moral ledger, because you caused it and you intended for it to happen. But in the case of a structural injustice engendered or grounded responsibility, it's not really attributable, right? I can't say, Reed, you've developed this responsibility because you're Reed. This is a general duty or a general responsibility that applies to Reed, Brian, and perhaps all of you listening back at home. So surely there's an asymmetry here. Now, I'm not convinced this asymmetry, therefore, proves that one is real and the other is not. That's my first response to this challenge. And the second thought is, maybe this is the beauty of the social connection model. And that's where we'll eventually return to the question about teeth later and how we can enforce this later. But by and large, we don't only have attributable responsibilities or attribution engendered responsibilities in our lives. The duty to donate, the duty to save drowning children. This is not because I'm Reed or I'm Brian that I am therefore in possession of this duty. It's instead in virtue of the relationship between myself and, of course, individuals in distress that are contingently generated by the circumstances in which we interact, right? So if I were not walking past a drowning child in a shallow pond, I would not have that duty activated, and I would not be committing a wrong by not complying with that duty, or at least I wouldn't be seen as sub-erogatory because I'm not in a position to save that drowning child 5 miles away. So that's just what I want to say in response to your pushback.
Okay, that is helpful. I'm not sure what the last part. I think that the fact that you're walking by makes it distinctly attributable to you and not someone else because the other person
but it's contingently
by. But whatever, that's
right.
Yeah, exactly. But put that to the side. That's not a big deal. Let me ask you this, and this may maybe gets us back to the teeth question. What's the difference between saying it would be nice if people did some things about this injustice and people are forward-looking responsible, to do things about this injustice. Is there a difference between those two things? In the first, it's meant to be, I hear it in a supererogatory sense. You're going above and beyond the duty to be really nice, but you're not. And in the responsibility, I take it there's a kind of requirement, so it's not supererogatory.
Good.
Is there that difference? I think there has to be. And B, if there is that difference, how do we know, so to speak, that we're talking about a kind of responsibility instead of a kind of moral goodness?
Very good.
That's above and beyond the call of duty.
Young gave us the seeds of an answer in her account, where she talked about the political responsibility we accrue. And yet, of course, whenever we mention political responsibility, folks get allergic, right? They start saying, oh, you're talking about political duties, political legitimacy, social contract, all that. But no, I think this is a misreading of Young, because her reading of the political is in some ways informed by Hannah Arendt, right? And it's informed by this concept of the demos, the collective, the political being an organic sort of part of the vita activa, an action that we pursue as members of the human species. So setting aside all of these lofty ideals in practice, she would posit that in contrast to the general, it would be nice if you did it, in brackets, in a moral sense. Specifically, one has, in a political sense, forward-looking responsibilities that one could cash out through collective organization, mass assembly, protests, or agitating for change via political institutions and structures. So for her, it's a wholesale package, whereas I'm actually quite flexible. I don't think forward-looking responsibilities have to be discharged politically. I could also discharge it apolitically via corporations or individually without invoking others in my community. If I'm very powerful, if I'm, Winston Lord or Lex Luthor coming to reconcile with my past wrongdoings, I might just pull this off as a one-man band, even as a Superman, so to speak, right? So it doesn't have to be a collective discharging process, so to speak, vis-a-vis responsibilities, but it needs to be political. And that is what Young argued and advocated, and I'm very happy to draw upon her here to explain the conceptual distinction between the two interpretations you raised there. But of course, then the question becomes, what does that mean in practice? And this is where I'm going to kill two birds with one stone, even if that's anti-bird rights, which is sad. But I'm going to say that we can actually resolve both the teeth problem and the distinction problem by invoking the notion of criticizability. Again, this is a Iris Marion Young construct where she says, one may not be blameworthy for failing to discharge duties that are forward-looking, but one can be criticized as such. And of course, there's been a lot of debate back and forth, secondary literature, Jeff Raymond, Martha Nussbaum, saying, what does this criticizability mean? So I can criticize you for all sorts of things and criticize you for speaking too quickly and criticize you for having a very dynamic interview style, whatever. But such criticism does not amount to the same kind of criticism as what Young would have expected, right? Those who repeatedly ignore their forward-looking responsibilities to have levied towards them and directed towards them. So this is where I would say this is a normative sense of criticism. One is normatively criticizable if one fails to discharge forward-looking responsibilities. And when not, such normative criticizability therefore translates to a permission on a part of other actors to intervene, to require you, perhaps, or at least to strongly nudge you to take up these responsibilities. That, I think, remains a hitherto underexplored and discussed aspect of Iris Marion Young's work, which is essentially, does criticizability give rise to third-party centered and grounded responsibilities to enforce whatever one is being criticized for not upholding or implementing in practice?
Yeah. So there's a way in which I'm with you and a way in which I'm not. So one thing that it feels to me that you're doing is you're making criticism quite flirtatious with. I think there's a way of criticizing that isn't associated with blame, and there is a kind of criticism that
Sure.
is. So an example that occurs to me of criticizing that's not blame, that it's not also blaming is I might say that some kid is a spoiled brat. This kid's a spoiled brat.
Yeah.
And you might say, it's not his, that's a criticism.
Yeah.
And you might say, it's not his fault, it's his parents. And I say, I'm not blaming the kid for being a spoiled brat. It's his parents' fault, it's not him. But nonetheless, the kid's a spoiled brat. So I could see how criticism can come apart from blame. Yeah. Maybe you think about it as something like, it's an evaluation of a character, independent from any evaluation of their responsibility for the character they formed. That's a kind. Anyway, so I could see that. But now once we get to intervention, nudging / forcing, compelling, I think we're beginning to get into the realm of blaming.
So we need blame.
You didn't do this thing, and now I'm going to get you to do it. It's at least something quite significant, because we're at least doing things like we're now trying to potentially impinge upon their autonomy in the name of getting them to discharge their responsibility. So you might not call it blame, but if it looks like blame and it smells like blame and blah, blah, blah.
But what about your nan? Was your nan blaming you when she said, you've got to do your due share for the backyard and the garden?
Probably she was, but...
Not necessarily, though, right? When she said, Reed, you've got to do this, that's not a sign that you're blameworthy.
Well, but if I hadn't
done it... She wouldn't
blame
you either. She would say, hey, why haven't you done what you're supposed to do? Go do it. And you would say, okay, I'll do it.
She would have blamed me for having not done it. Been like... She would have think that I've done the wrong thing and it's my fault because I made the decision to do the wrong thing.
Okay, maybe in some other cases, though, they're equally plausible. They're not your nan and yourself. The nan would say, hey, you really ought to do it. This is a part of what you ought to do. But she wouldn't say, in not doing it, you're blameworthy, or I'm going to hold you blameworthy for not doing that. That's I guess this is where our intuitions come apart, which is essentially how fine-grained, and this is an interesting methodological point as well, how fine-grained are our normative intuitions and normative instincts and reactions to others, such that we can actually allow for maintenance of this, and almost, you might say, very much like angels dancing on a pin distinction in the eyes of some between blameworthiness, criticizability, and just a complete blame-free and criticism-free or criticizability-free responsibility. And I suppose this really depends on the cultural context and also the normative settings and behaviors of the people around us and in which we operate. So it's a very good point you're raising there.
Okay, so I think at the end of the day, let me see if I could just paint the picture. The picture is one according to which we have these forward-looking responsibilities. If we fail to discharge those we have those responsibilities by virtue of us playing a role in injustice, more specifically the role that we play is one in which we help to reinforce the reproduction of the systems that create the injustices. And for our role, we are not necessarily blameworthy in some deep and important way, but we are nonetheless potentially in breach of forward-looking responsibilities. And because we are in breach of forward-looking responsibilities, there's a sort of open question to be had about the extent to which people can intervene and get us to do the thing that we ought to do, even though we're not blameworthy if we don't do it. So that's the picture. Yeah. I mean, that's super fascinating, super helpful. And I hope the audience is walking away with, we started on things like biased AI and privacy violations and who's responsible, but it's very, to me, and I hope to the audience, it's very edifying to see the way in which you can start with this thread of this is terrible shit, and then back into, okay, now let's think about how does that make us think about, if you like, our moral universe more broadly.
Absolutely. And I think I just wanted to say, Reed, to those of you listening back at home, Reed is truly quite an exceptional podcast host. So lucid and so methodical in a way he interrogates, or rather gets the best out of his guests. So I really would encourage you to follow and listen to and subscribe to Reed, because I really enjoyed this two-part conversation. Thank you, Reed.
Yeah. So did I. Appreciate it. I definitely won't cut that part out. And we'll have to do this again. I'm sure you've got lots more views for us to talk about.
Thank you, Reed. And just to flag, if I may, very quickly, these views and these arguments that I discussed in this podcast, I'll be encapsulating or presenting a condensed version of it in an upcoming book, hopefully to be published no later than Q1 next year, on the ethics of geopolitics and AI, or ethics of the geopolitics of AI. And that's going to be coming out next year with a CP. So thank you guys very much.
Yeah, no, that's great. We'll put that in the show notes. And when it does come out, let me know. And I'll make sure to post it on my socials.
Thank you so much, Reed. Appreciate it. Have a lovely day. Take care.
Thank you,
bye-bye. Ciao.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I want to thank a few people who make this all possible. Delano Alexander, he's my producer. He does such an amazing job on everything that he touches. Garrett Lang is the sound engineer. That's honestly, he's too good for me. Athmia Jairam has joined us recently. He's helping us find the best guests to bring onto this podcast. And Ashley Wassilenko helps us organize all this, get people on the schedule, get people's bios, headshots, and really keeps the train on the track. So thanks, guys. Really appreciate all the hard work you do.